The air in that courtroom felt heavier than I'd remembered from all my years sitting quietly behind my son. It was Monday morning, yet the tension inside those four walls made time itself feel slower. Wooden benches creaked under the weight of people waiting for someone else's pain to end. Lawyers murmured. Papers shuffled. My son, Owen, sat at the defense table, staring down at his folded hands like a man waiting for a verdict on his soul. Then it happened. The judge walked in robes dark, expression carved in stone. His gavel hit the desk once. The sound echoed through the room like a single heartbeat, loud enough to make even the boldest mouths fall silent. Everyone stood, then sat again, all according to the ritual of justice. But this morning, justice was about to lose its composure. When his eyes lifted from his documents and met mine, something inside that courtroom shifted. His stare froze halfway between confusion and disbelief. The judge's lips parted slightly before he caught himself. He blinked twice, as if the sight of me didn't belong to this day, to this hour. Then, in a voice rough with shock, he leaned forward and whispered, "Why are you here?" Every head in the courtroom turned. My son, the attorneys, the clerk, each one caught in that strange, suspended silence. My daughter-in-law stiffened at her table, her hand gripping her lawyer's arm. And I stood there, a gray-haired woman in a blue coat, holding my purse like it was a shield. The sound of his words still hung in the air. What could make a judge a man feared by lawyers, obeyed by all, speak with that kind of trembling recognition? If you were me, what would you have said? Stay with me. You're about to find out why those 5 words stopped the room cold. For a few seconds, no one moved. Even the air stopped. The judge's words seemed to hang somewhere between us, too strange to ignore, too intimate to explain. My son, Owen, turned in his seat, eyes wide with alarm. He looked at me the way a child looks at the storm rolling in, wanting to stand tall, yet terrified of what it might bring. Cassandra, his wife soon to be his ex, shifted in her seat, with a small nervous laugh, as though she could brush off the tension. But her parents weren't laughing. They were staring at me, brows furrowed, lips pressed thin. They knew my name, of course. Everyone in Willow Creek knew who I was, but they didn't know me, not really. And they had no idea that the man wearing that black robe once did. The courtroom clerk looked unsure whether to call for order or just hold her breath. Mr. Sterling, Cassandra's attorney, cleared his throat, pretending to continue his closing argument, but the words died before they reached his tongue. All eyes shifted back to the judge. He didn't speak again. He simply stared at me, an old memory flickering in his eyes, one I recognized even across the distance of decades. I didn't answer him. I didn't need to. My silence was its own declaration. Slowly, I began to walk forward. Each step echoed softly against the tile, a rhythm that filled the quiet. Every movement felt deliberate, every second stretched thin. When I reached the front row, I stopped right behind my son and placed a hand on his shoulder. He didn't look up, but I felt the tremor run through him. My presence was enough. The judge blinked once, exhaled, and straightened in his chair. Whatever storm had passed through his face vanished behind the mask of authority once more. But it was too late. The damage was done. What memory could shake a man sworn to uphold the law? Don't go anywhere, because this story doesn't start in that courtroom. It started 60 years earlier. The gavel struck once more, but this time, the sound wasn't just a signal for order, it was a warning. The judge's composure returned, yet his hands tightened around the handle like he was gripping a memory he wished had stayed buried. He cleared his throat. "Proceed," he said, his voice steadier now, but not untouched. The courtroom moved again slowly, cautiously, like everyone sensed that something had shifted, even if they couldn't name it. Mr. Sterling fumbled with his papers, his confidence faltering for the first time that morning. Cassandra leaned toward her mother, whispering frantically. Her father's face reddened, frustration replacing confusion. And there I stood, behind my son, calm on the outside, heart thundering in my chest. For years I had promised myself I'd never cross paths with this man again, but fate has a cruel sense of timing. Sometimes it waits until your life is on fire before handing you the one person who once helped you build it. The judge's eyes flickered toward me once more just for a heartbeat, and in that glance, I saw the boy he used to be. The boy who once hid his bruises under long sleeves. The boy who had cried over shattered marbles in the mud. He hadn't forgotten. Neither had I. So I lifted my chin and met his gaze, steady and unflinching. Not out of defiance, but because there are moments in life when you must remind people who they are and what they owe to the truth. He blinked, looked away, and announced a short recess. The gavel fell again, and whispers exploded across the room. But through the noise, one thought pulsed clear and loud in my mind. The past had finally come to collect. Stay with me. You'll understand why that one meeting after 60 long years would turn a courtroom into a battlefield. My name is Elara Peterson, though most folks in Willow Creek, Virginia just call me Miss Elara. I've lived in this town my whole life. Long enough to see its people grow older, its stories repeat themselves, and its kindness fade in the faces of those who think money can buy respect. I wasn't born into comfort. My husband and I built our life from the ground up, one paycheck, one prayer, and one sleepless night at a time. He's gone now, but the lessons we shared still sit with me every morning when I pour my coffee. Stand tall, stay kind, and protect your own. My son, Owen, was our pride. A quiet man, thoughtful in ways that made people overlook him. He taught history at the local high school, the kind of teacher who stayed late to help a struggling student and spent his own money to buy class supplies when the district cut funding. His students adored him, even when the world outside those classroom walls barely noticed. But life, as I've learned, has a way of testing gentle souls the hardest. Owen met Cassandra Vane at a charity event. She was beautiful, sharp-featured, confident, and dressed in the kind of elegance that made everyone turn their heads. When she smiled at my son that evening, he thought the world had finally noticed him. I still remember the way he told me about her on the phone that night. His voice carried something I hadn't heard in years, hope. When they married, the church bells rang for miles. Cassandra's family attended in tailored perfection, her father, Alistair Vane, and her mother, Doreen, with expressions that never softened, not even during the vows. They came from wealth that stretched back generations, the kind of people who measure worth by inheritance and lineage, not by kindness or humility. They shook my hand with polite smiles that didn't reach their eyes. To them, my son was a charity case. To me, their daughter was a second chance at family. At least, that's what I thought at the time. From the outside, Owen and Cassandra seemed perfect. He brought warmth, she brought ambition. They bought a modest home on the edge of town, and for a while, it looked like happiness might live there. But happiness doesn't survive long in the company of arrogance. Cassandra had a habit of pointing out the differences between her world and ours. She spoke of her family's properties, their gatherings, their standards. Every compliment carried an insult, hidden just underneath, subtle, but sharp enough to leave a mark. At first, Owen laughed it off. He believed love was enough to bridge any distance. He'd tell me, "Mom, she's just used to another life. She'll come around." I wanted to believe him, but every time I saw them together, something inside me whispered otherwise. It wasn't long before Cassandra began reshaping my son's life to fit her image of success. She urged him to leave teaching and pursue something more profitable. She criticized the car he drove, the shirts he wore, even the way he greeted neighbors. Every piece of him she could change, she did, and the parts she couldn't, she belittled. Still, my son held on. He loved her more than his own peace, and that was his greatest mistake. Whenever I visited, I saw little signs that told me all wasn't well. Owen's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. The house felt colder, quieter. Cassandra's tone when she addressed him was clipped, rehearsed. I once caught her rolling her eyes while he was speaking about a student who'd just won a scholarship. She didn't see me watching, but I did. Her parents' disdain made everything worse. They rarely called him by name, only your husband, or the teacher. To them, marriage to Owen was an inconvenience their daughter would one day correct. Still, I tried to keep peace. I told myself love can soften even the proudest hearts. I told myself she would see what I saw in him. But the day I walked into that courtroom and saw her smirking across the aisle, I realized I'd been wrong all along. I thought I'd gained a daughter that day, but I was wrong. Stay with me. The story of how she tried to destroy my son didn't begin in that courtroom, but it would end there. At first, the changes were small, barely noticeable unless you were paying attention. Cassandra stopped joining Owen for Sunday dinners. She claimed she was too busy, though she never explained doing what. She started arriving at family gatherings late, her perfume announcing her before her voice did. When they were newlyweds, she used to reach for his hand under the table. Now she scrolled through her phone, pretending not to notice his silence. I watched my son shrink without realizing it. He began second-guessing himself in conversations, apologizing for things that didn't need apologies. When he'd talk about his students or the history projects he loved, Cassandra would smile, that polite smile, the kind people wear when they're enduring a story they don't care about. She made subtle jabs that cut deep. "You're wasting your potential." Or, "Maybe if you dressed better, people would take you seriously." Those weren't words of love. They were weapons polished to look like advice. I confronted her once, quietly, after she criticized the old truck Owen used for school errands. I said, "You knew who he was when you married him." She tilted her head and smiled a thin, empty smile. "People evolve, Mrs. Peterson. Maybe it's time Owen did too." That night, I went home uneasy. I told myself every marriage had its storms, but I could feel something shifting, and this storm didn't sound like thunder. It sounded like warning bells. Have you ever watched someone weaponize love itself? Cassandra began treating her marriage like a performance for the people she wanted to impress. In front of her friends, she'd cling to Owen's arm, calling him my brilliant husband. But when the guests left, her tone changed. She'd pick apart his sentences, his choices, his quiet nature, calling it weakness. The Vanes, her parents, didn't help. At family dinners, Alistair would make sly remarks about how hard it must be to carry someone through life on a teacher's salary. Doreen would smile and say, "But at least he's humble." Owen would pretend not to hear, though I could see the way his jaw tightened each time. He once told me, "Mom, I don't want to make a scene. They're her family." I told him gently, "There's a difference between peace and surrender." Months passed. Cassandra began locking him out of conversations about their finances. She opened accounts he knew nothing about. I saw the mail pile up envelopes addressed to her only. The warmth between them cooled, replaced by formality. He called her Cassie less. She called him Owen, like it was an obligation. I remember one night vividly. Owen showed up at my door, rain-soaked and exhausted. He sat at my kitchen table, staring at the mug of coffee I placed before him. "She doesn't see me anymore," he whispered. "I'm invisible in my own house." I reached across and held his hand. "You're not invisible to me." He smiled faintly, but his eyes gave him away. He already knew what was coming. He just didn't have the strength to name it yet. The divorce papers came in a neat white envelope, cold, efficient, cruel. Cassandra claimed irreconcilable differences, but that was just the beginning. Inside those pages were accusations that twisted truth into something ugly. Claims of emotional neglect, financial recklessness, even implied instability. It wasn't a divorce, it was a character assassination dressed as paperwork. The Vans funded her legal team. Her lawyer, Mr. Sterling, was known in town for turning half-truths into headlines. He built a case designed not to separate two people, but to bury one of them. Owen, being the honest man he was, still believed fairness would prevail. "She's angry, Mom. Once she calms down, she'll see reason," he said. But Cassandra had no intention of calming down. She wanted victory, not closure. Court dates were scheduled. Rumors began to circulate around Willow Creek, whispers that my son had problems. Parents started looking uneasy when he greeted them at school. One even requested their child be transferred from his class. Each lie landed like a hammer blow, and each one took a piece of him away. I watched the light fade from his eyes, the same eyes that once lit up when he spoke of changing lives through teaching. His posture changed. His voice grew quieter. It was as though he was preparing to disappear, to spare everyone else the discomfort of seeing him. That's when I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. A mother can endure many things, but watching her child be destroyed by deceit isn't one of them. So I made myself a promise. If they wanted to fight dirty, they would soon learn what it meant to fight someone who had nothing left to lose. Like, share, and tell me who's the real victim here. The courthouse smelled of dust, old wood, and tension. Every step I took down those echoing halls reminded me that justice, in this place, belonged to whoever could afford it. Cassandra arrived surrounded by confidence, her parents in tailored suits, her lawyer carrying himself like a man already certain of victory. Owen looked smaller that morning. His tie was too tight, his shoulders slumped, his eyes hollow. He wasn't just fighting for his reputation, he was fighting for his dignity. When we took our seats, I felt dozens of eyes watching. The Vanes never missed a chance to perform. They greeted familiar faces in the gallery, with polite nods, as though this wasn't a trial but a charity gala. Cassandra adjusted her sleeve, the sparkle of her bracelet catching the light, another quiet reminder that power often dresses in elegance. Mr. Sterling opened the proceedings with practiced charm. His voice carried confidence, every word carefully measured to sound like truth. He painted my son as unreliable, unstable, a man who couldn't manage his finances or emotions. Each sentence was a needle meant to pierce Owen's character. Every time my son tried to defend himself, Mr. Sterling interrupted with another accusation wrapped in politeness. The judge sat expressionless. The gallery whispered. Cassandra watched, lips pressed in faint satisfaction. And I sat there, gripping my purse tightly, forcing myself not to stand. Not yet. There are few things worse than watching lies take root, while truth struggles to breathe. One by one, they came. A former co-worker, coached into exaggerating disagreements, a distant cousin claiming Owen was emotionally cold, even a former student repeating rumors that had spread through town. Each word chipped away at the man I'd raised. I recognized every tactic, each witness chosen for sympathy, each story rehearsed to sound heartbreaking but hollow. Mr. Sterling moved like a performer, pacing slowly, lowering his tone at key moments to sound sincere. He called Cassandra to the stand, and she played her role flawlessly. She spoke in measured sorrow, pretending to tremble when describing Owen's supposed cruelty. Her eyes glistened when she mentioned sleepless nights and emotional trauma. She paused, glanced toward the judge, then continued, "I did everything to save our marriage, but I couldn't live in fear anymore." A murmur swept through the room. Her parents exchanged looks of dignified pain. To anyone who didn't know her, Cassandra looked like a wounded saint. But I did know her. I knew that voice, soft when she lied, brittle when she was cornered. I saw the glint in her eyes when she realized her performance was landing. My son sat silent, hands folded, refusing to interrupt. He was raised to respect authority, even when it was undeserved. The hardest part wasn't hearing the lies. It was seeing the people in the gallery believe them. By the third day, my patience had worn thin. Each witness felt like another hammer striking my son's back. The Vanes walked in and out of the courtroom as though it were theirs, offering polite smiles to the press waiting by the doors. Mr. Sterling grew bolder, ending his statements with smug half-bows toward the judge. Even the bailiff looked uneasy, sensing how uneven the scales had become. Owen's lawyer, a young man clearly outmatched, did his best to respond, but his words lacked the weight of experience. He spoke truth, but truth spoken softly rarely wins against lies, delivered confidently. I sat through it all, my hands folded in my lap, appearing calm. But my mind was recording every detail, the witnesses, their inconsistencies, the moments when Cassandra's eyes darted nervously toward her lawyer. When the session ended that afternoon, Cassandra brushed past me without a glance. Her perfume lingered in the air, cold and expensive. That was when I realized something crucial. People like her win because others allow them to. I wouldn't be one of those people. As I walked out of the courtroom beside my defeated son, I made a vow in silence. They wanted humiliation, they'd get justice. They wanted to play dirty, I'd bring something cleaner but far more powerful memory. Because I knew something they didn't. The judge sitting at that bench wasn't just a stranger. He was part of my story, and soon, he'd remember why. They wanted a war? Then I'd give them one. Comment, yes, if you've ever seen arrogance crumble in real life. 2 days before the final hearing, the house felt heavier than usual. The clock ticked too loudly, the wind pressed against the windows, and the kettle's whistle startled me more than it should have. Silence can be peaceful, but that weekend, it carried a weight I couldn't explain. Owen had stopped by earlier that morning to drop off a folder. Just notes, he'd said, trying to sound casual, but his voice cracked halfway through the sentence. When he left, I stood by the door longer than I meant to, watching his car disappear down the street. I brewed a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the steam curling upward. It reminded me of all the nights I'd sat in this same spot helping Owen with school projects, patching up scraped knees, reminding him that kindness was strength, not weakness. But now, that same kindness was being used against him. The hearing on Monday would decide more than finances. It would decide how the world saw him. I'd never felt so powerless in my life. I'd prayed, I'd hoped, but something inside me whispered that faith alone wasn't enough anymore. As the afternoon light faded, a memory began pressing forward, uninvited but persistent. A boy with torn shoes, a jar of broken marbles, a cry that still echoed somewhere deep inside me. For years, I'd tried to bury that chapter of my life, but some memories refused to fade. Some people, no matter how far time takes them, find their way back into your story. I set the teacup down and whispered to myself, Harry Farrow. I never thought I'd hear that name again. Ever wondered how one childhood act can echo 60 years later? It was the spring of 1957. I was 8 years old, all knees and freckles, wearing a dress my mother had sewn from leftover fabric. Our school sat at the edge of town, small and creaky, where the smell of chalk and damp wood never quite left. That's where I met him, Harry Farrow. He was smaller than the other boys, quiet, with eyes that seemed to notice everything but never lingered long enough to challenge anyone. His father worked odd jobs when he wasn't drinking, and everyone in class knew it. Children can be cruel when they sense weakness. One afternoon, I saw a group of boys corner him behind the old oak tree near the schoolyard. They teased him, calling him names, tugging at his shirt, laughing as they snatched away the glass jar he carried everywhere. Inside that jar were marbles, bright, swirling colors he'd spent months saving for. When they smashed the jar, the marbles scattered across the dirt, like tiny stars losing their shine. Harry froze, tears slipping down his cheeks as the others walked away laughing. Something inside me snapped. I didn't think, I just acted. I picked up the largest branch I could find and planted myself between him and the bullies. You touch him again, and I'll make you regret it, I'd said. They laughed, but they didn't come back. I helped him gather the broken glass and dirty marbles. Half were cracked, but I gave him some of mine to replace them. They're yours now, I told him. Nobody breaks your things again. He smiled through his tears, a shy, grateful kind of smile. That day, he started walking home with me after school. And in time, he stopped being the boy everyone picked on. He became my friend, the kind of friend who listens, remembers, and never forgets a kindness. At least, that's who he was back then. The memory faded as quickly as it came, leaving me staring at my reflection in the darkened window. My hair was gray now, my hands lined with years of work and loss. Yet the girl who stood up for a lonely boy still lived somewhere in me. When Owen told me weeks ago that his divorce case would be presided over by Judge Harrison Farrow, I'd felt something twist inside my chest. I brushed it off at the time. How many Farrows could there be? But when I saw the name printed on the court documents, I knew. It was him. For 60 years, our lives had run on different tracks. I stayed in Willow Creek, building a life of small joys and quiet struggles. He left, chasing something bigger, law school, success, respect. And now fate, with its strange sense of timing, had placed him in the one seat that could change everything for my son. It wasn't coincidence. It couldn't be. That night, I sat on the porch, the air cool against my skin, and let the past wash over me. I remembered the way Harry used to thank me for standing up for him. He once told me, "Elara, I'll never forget that day as long as I live." Maybe he hadn't. Maybe the universe had just found the right moment to remind him. I looked toward the night sky and whispered, "Harry, if you still remember who you were, remember me too." Because come Monday, I would walk into that courtroom not as a spectator, but as a reminder. A reminder of the debt between us, and of the boy who once swore to repay it. Destiny doesn't knock twice. It waits until you're strong enough to open the door. Back then, Willow Creek wasn't much more than a cluster of small houses, a feed store, a diner, and the school that sat at the edge of a long dirt road. Children walked to class carrying tin lunch boxes and worn notebooks. Summers smelled of cut grass and chalk dust. I was 8 years old, Elara Monroe, then. My father worked at the mill. My mother sewed clothes for the neighbors. Life wasn't easy, but it was steady. Every morning, I'd walk the mile to Willow Creek Elementary, shoes dusty by the time I reached the steps. The schoolyard was our whole world: laughter, scraped knees, secrets whispered behind hands. But it was also where I first learned how cruel children could be when someone didn't fit their mold. That someone was Harry Farrow. He sat at the back of the class, quiet, often alone. His clothes were too big, The knees of his pants patched over so many times they hardly looked like fabric anymore. His father was known around town for drinking more than he worked, and that reputation followed Harry like a shadow. The other boys gave him a name, Hobo Harry. They thought it was funny. Teachers didn't stop it. They just pretended not to hear. But I heard it. I saw the way his hands trembled when he reached for his books, the way his eyes darted to the floor when someone laughed. One Friday after school, I saw him walking home, clutching a small glass jar filled with marbles. He'd been saving his allowance for months to buy them. They were bright, beautiful red, blue, and green, catching light like tiny treasures. He noticed me watching and smiled, shy but proud. "Got 'em from the store in town," he said softly. "Traded my lunch money all week." He didn't know that smile would stay with me for the rest of my life. The following Monday changed everything. It was recess, the sun was high, and the children ran wild across the dusty yard. I was playing jump rope near the fence when I heard shouting behind the old oak tree. Laughter followed, cruel, sharp, unmistakable. I ran closer and saw them, the mayor's son, Bobby Lang, and two others circling Harry like hunters. They'd snatched his backpack, scattering his books on the ground. Bobby held Harry's marble jar in his hand, shaking it so the glass clinked against the lid. "Bet these are all he owns," Bobby sneered. "Maybe they'll shine better in the mud." Before Harry could reach for it, Bobby dropped the jar. The sound of breaking glass sliced through the air. The marbles rolled across the dirt, some sinking into puddles from the morning rain. Harry didn't shout. He just knelt, staring at the shards, his small fingers shaking as he tried to pick up what he could. The other children watched from a distance. No one moved, no one helped. Something inside me caught fire. I marched up, grabbed Bobby by the arm, and twisted hard enough to make him yelp. "Leave him alone," I snapped. "You're not half the boy he is." He called me names, but I didn't care. I stood my ground until they left, snickering and kicking at the dirt. When they were gone, I knelt beside Harry. He looked up at me, eyes red, voice barely a whisper. "They broke 'em," he said. I started gathering marbles with him, wiping each one clean before placing it gently into my own jar. I remember handing him half of mine, smooth, bright, unbroken. "They're yours now," I told him. "Nobody gets to break your things again." He looked at me for a long time, like he was trying to memorize the moment. "Thank you," he said softly. That day, something unspoken formed between us, a bond stronger than friendship, a silent promise. We'd look out for each other. Neither of us knew that promise would outlive childhood. After that day, Harry and I were rarely apart. We walked home together, shared lunches, and studied side by side. I saw how his confidence began to return, how the laughter of others no longer pierced as deeply. He started carrying a new jar, half his marbles, half mine. I never told him, but I liked knowing that a part of me went with him wherever he went. Years passed, and our paths began to split. I stayed in Willow Creek. Harry earned a scholarship to a law program in Richmond. On the day he left, he handed me one of the marbles from that shared jar. It was blue, with a white swirl through the center. He said, "You stood up for me when no one else did. I'll never forget." I laughed, teasing him that he'd better not forget once he became important. He smiled in that shy, grateful way and promised, "If I ever do, I'll owe you until the day I remember." We lost touch over the years, different lives, different worlds. But the marble stayed on my dresser through everything: marriage, motherhood, and eventually, widowhood. It became a symbol of something I couldn't name at the time. What you give freely often comes back when you need it most. That weekend, as I looked at that same blue marble resting in a small wooden box, I felt the years close in around me. I whispered to the quiet room, "Harry, I hope you kept yours." Because the next time I'd see that boy, no longer a child, no longer powerless, he'd be wearing a judge's robe, holding not marbles, but my son's future in his hands. I never thought those marbles would roll back into my life. Monday arrived heavy with expectation. The courthouse looked the same as it had in every hearing, before gray walls, wooden benches, the same air of forced civility. But something in me knew this day would not end like the others. Owen sat at the defense table, hands clasped, shoulders squared in quiet defiance. He looked exhausted but calm, like a man who'd accepted his fate and refused to show fear. Cassandra sat across the aisle, flawless as ever, wearing a powder blue suit and that same expression of smug control. Her parents flanked her like a royal guard. I arrived just before the session began. A minor delay at the security desk had kept me from entering sooner. Maybe that was fate too, because my timing couldn't have been more exact. When I walked into that courtroom, every seat was filled. Reporters lined the back wall. Neighbors whispered behind cupped hands. This was the grand finale, the day Cassandra expected to win, the day my son would lose everything. The bailiff called for order. All rise. Judge Harrison Farrow entered. His robe looked heavier than I remembered from my youth, but the man inside it still carried himself with quiet power. He nodded once, sat, and motioned for everyone to take their seats. I remained standing near the back, my heart drumming in my chest. As Cassandra's lawyer rose to give his closing argument, the world seemed to narrow. His voice filled the room, smooth, deliberate, poisonous. Your Honor, Mr. Sterling began. This case is not about revenge or bitterness. It is about justice for a woman who has endured emotional hardship and financial instability caused by a man unable to uphold his marital responsibilities. Every sentence was a dagger. Every pause was calculated for effect. Owen kept his eyes forward, jaw tight, fingers twisting together under the table. I watched quietly from the back, unseen, yet fully present. I didn't know what would happen next, but I could feel the pull of something inevitable. Mr. Sterling continued, painting Cassandra as the perfect victim. He spoke of her sacrifice, her restraint, her courage. The audience hung on every word, as though they were hearing gospel instead of fiction. He turned toward the judge, voice rising with mock sincerity. My client seeks only what is fair, a chance to rebuild her life after years of silent suffering. He paused dramatically, scanning the room. Isn't that what this court stands for? The words lingered. Then, a small sound broke the silence, the soft click of a door closing. Heads turned. I had stepped fully into the courtroom. Mr. Sterling faltered, eyes darting toward me, clearly irritated by the interruption. But his irritation vanished when he saw the judge's reaction. Judge Farrow's gaze had shifted. His expression, once composed, froze in disbelief. His eyes locked on me like time itself had stopped. Mr. Sterling hesitated, confused. Your Honor? But the judge didn't answer. He just stared. His lips parted slightly before he caught himself, his gavel hand hovering mid-air. That's when he whispered it, barely audible, yet loud enough to still every breath in the room. Why are you here? The microphone carried it across the space, each word landing like a thunderclap. Every head turned toward me. Cassandra's confident smile vanished. Her mother clutched her pearls. Even the bailiff seemed unsure of what to do. Owen turned in his seat, eyes wide with disbelief. Mom? He mouthed. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I simply stood there, calm and silent, my gaze meeting the judge's. He blinked, realization dawning in his face, a memory from decades ago surfacing behind those steady eyes. For a moment, the courtroom wasn't filled with lawyers or whispers. It was filled with the past two children standing behind an old oak tree, one defending the other. Mr. Sterling tried to recover. Your Honor, if we could. The judge held up his hand, silencing him without a word. His voice, when it returned, was strained but controlled. The court will take a short recess. He struck the gavel once, but the sound felt different this time, less about law, more about memory. Whispers erupted across the room. Cassandra spun around, confusion etched on her face. What's going on? She hissed to her lawyer. I walked slowly down the aisle, every step deliberate. The noise around me blurred into nothing. I reached my son's side, laid a gentle hand on his shoulder, and leaned in just enough for him to hear. It's all right, I said softly. We're not done yet. Judge Farrow rose from the bench, his eyes never leaving mine. For the briefest second, I saw him as he once was, the boy with scraped knees and a jar of marbles clutched to his chest. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, then turned and disappeared into his chambers. The bailiff called. Court in recess. The crowd buzzed, desperate for explanations. But I stayed where I was, standing tall behind my son, feeling the weight of 60 years settle into purpose. I'd spent a lifetime protecting what I loved. Now, that protection had finally found its way back to me. What do you think he saw in me that made him stop mid-sentence? Stay close, because what happened after that recess would change everything. The moment the gavel struck, the sound echoed through my chest. I watched as Judge Farrow rose from his seat, straightened his robe, and and walked through the side door leading to his chambers. Before disappearing, he made the smallest motion with his hand, subtle, almost unnoticeable, but clear to me. It wasn't a command. It was a request. The bailiff approached, leaning close enough to whisper, "Ma'am, the judge would like to see you in his office." Owen turned toward me, his face drawn tight. "Mom, what's going on?" I touched his hand lightly. "Stay here. Trust me." The room hummed with curiosity as I followed the bailiff down the narrow hallway. My shoes clicked softly against the polished floor. Each step carried 60 years of unspoken history. When we reached the door, the bailiff nodded once and stepped aside. I entered. The chambers were smaller than I expected. Stacks of legal documents lined the shelves. A single photograph of a young boy fishing with his father sat on the desk, frozen innocence in a world built on judgment. Judge Harrison Farrow stood by the window, robe loosened, hands clasped behind his back. When he turned, I saw the years carved into his face, but beneath them was the same boy I'd once defended. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Finally, he broke the silence. "Elara Monroe," he said softly, using my maiden name. "I haven't heard that in decades." I managed a faint smile. "It's been a long time, Harry." He nodded, eyes narrowing with something between disbelief and recognition. "When I saw you walk in, it felt like the past reached out and grabbed me by the throat." I stepped closer. "Maybe the past was just waiting for the right moment to remind you who you are." He gestured toward the chair across from his desk. "Please, sit." I did. The room was quiet enough that I could hear the faint ticking of a wall clock. "You saved me once," he began, his voice low, steady. "All those years ago. You probably don't remember how bad it was. My father, he wasn't kind. I went to school most days hungry and scared. When those boys broke my marbles, it wasn't about glass, it was about dignity, and you gave it back to me." I looked at him, seeing not the powerful judge, but the boy whose tears had streaked through dirt on a playground long ago. "I remember," I said, "and you don't owe me for that. You just needed someone to remind you that you mattered." He nodded slowly. "And you're here now, reminding me again." I took a breath. "I didn't come here for favors, Harry. My son doesn't need charity. He needs fairness. Cassandra's family has twisted the truth, and you know it. You've seen this before, people, with money crushing those who don't have it." He said nothing, but his eyes shifted, the weight of my words settling on his conscience. "You remember how it felt," I continued, "when people laughed at your clothes, when they decided your worth before you ever spoke. That's what they're doing to him. My son may not have wealth, but he has honor, and right now, that's being taken from him piece by piece." The judge turned away, staring out the window at the courthouse lawn. "You're asking me to cross a line," he murmured. "No," I said firmly. "I'm asking you to see clearly, to do what the law already allows, only this time, with open eyes." He let out a long breath, his shoulders sagging slightly. "Do you think I've forgotten what it's like to be powerless?" I met his gaze. "I think you've spent your life making sure no one ever saw that side of you again." For a heartbeat, silence filled the room. Then he nodded once, slow and deliberate, the kind of nod that said something had shifted deep inside him. When he finally spoke again, his voice was softer. "You haven't changed much, Elara. Still fierce, still unafraid to tell the truth no matter who's listening." I smiled faintly. "Age doesn't quiet conviction. It just teaches you when to use it." He moved to his desk, resting a hand on the blue marble sitting beside his papers. My breath caught when I saw it, the same marble I'd given him all those years ago. The colors had faded, but it was still whole. He followed my gaze and smiled. "I've kept it all my life. Reminds me of the day someone taught me courage." For a moment, the years vanished. "We were just two old souls revisiting a childhood promise," he said quietly. "You know, I swore that if I ever had power, I'd use it to protect people like the ones who once stood up for me. Somewhere along the way, I started forgetting why I made that vow." "Then remember now," I whispered, "because the boy you were would never let this stand." He turned the marble in his hand, eyes distant but resolute. "You've given me much to think about." "I didn't come to change your mind," I said, rising from my seat. "I came to remind you of who you've always been." He nodded again, a faint glimmer of emotion crossing his face. "You've done that." When I reached the door, he called after me. "Elara?" I turned. He held up the marble, letting the light catch it. "Some debts don't fade with time. Some stay waiting, quietly, until the right person walks through the door. I gave a small smile. Then I guess the wait is over. He didn't reply, but I saw the decision forming in his eyes, the same look he'd worn the day he first stood up to those boys behind the oak tree. He owed me nothing, but sometimes the past demands to be repaid. Subscribe, if you believe kindness never truly disappears. The recess lasted less than half an hour, though to me, it felt like a lifetime. When the bailiff's voice echoed through the hallway, "Court is back in session," I took a slow, steady breath and followed the crowd inside. Owen sat quietly at his table, unaware of what had taken place behind closed doors. His lawyer leaned in to whisper something, but he looked too drained to respond. Cassandra, on the other hand, looked radiant with confidence, mistaking the judge's absence for another advantage. Her parents whispered smug reassurances, their composure that of people who believed wealth could bend truth to their will. The judge re-entered the room, but this time, the energy changed. Harrison Farrow no longer carried the stiff neutrality of routine proceedings. His presence alone commanded silence. He adjusted his glasses, glanced at both counsels, and began speaking not hurriedly, but with the steady rhythm of a man who had seen too many lies paraded as truth. "This court," he said, "has reviewed all evidence presented over the past weeks, and before rendering a decision, I have revisited every testimony, every financial document, and every recorded statement. What I found requires clarification both for the integrity of this case and the dignity of those involved." Cassandra shifted uneasily. Mr. Sterling straightened, confident but cautious. Judge Farrow continued, his tone crisp. "Truth does not hide behind performance. It survives in details. And the details in this case tell a very different story." A whisper rippled through the courtroom. Cassandra's lawyer began to rise in protest, but the judge lifted a hand, silencing him instantly. "The floor is mine, counsel," he said firmly. "You've spoken long enough." Something in his voice cut through the air, controlled, deliberate, final. The judge turned a page on his notes. "Let us begin with financial records," he said. "According to bank statements, Miss Vane's claims of depleted savings and spousal dependency are inconsistent with recent deposits made to an account registered under her maiden name." He paused. The sound of Cassandra's breath faltering was almost audible. "Furthermore," he continued, "two witnesses presented by the plaintiff offered conflicting accounts regarding dates and incidents. When questioned about these inconsistencies, they attributed their information to Miss Vane's attorney, who allegedly provided them with prepared statements." A murmur swept through the room. Mr. Sterling's jaw tightened. He reached for a paper, as if he could erase his own fingerprints from it. Judge Farrow's tone grew colder. "This court will not tolerate the manipulation of testimony for personal gain. Such behavior not only disrespects the legal process, it erodes public faith in justice itself." He turned toward Cassandra, his expression unreadable. "You came here seeking restitution, but what you sought was not fairness. It was dominance. You attempted to weaponize this court to punish the man who once loved you." Cassandra's face drained of color. Her father leaned forward, whispering harshly in her ear, but she sat frozen. Then, the judge turned his gaze toward Owen. "Mr. Peterson, the evidence supports that you fulfilled every marital responsibility required of you. The accusations of abuse and financial misconduct lack substance and are hereby dismissed." Owen blinked, unsure whether he'd heard correctly. The judge wasn't finished. "The plaintiff's legal team is hereby sanctioned for professional misconduct. Falsified testimony, coerced statements, and the deliberate presentation of misleading information have no place in my courtroom." Gasps spread like ripples across the benches. Reporters scribbled furiously. The Vanes sat motionless, faces pale, posture rigid, as though the very foundation of their pride had cracked beneath them. The silence that followed wasn't peace. It was the sound of arrogance collapsing under truth's weight. When the gavel finally struck, the echo carried a different meaning. It wasn't the end of a trial. It was the sound of a lifetime debt quietly repaid. Judge Farrow leaned forward. "The court finds in favor of the defendant, Mr. Owen Peterson. All claims against him are dismissed. Furthermore, due to deliberate misuse of legal procedure, the plaintiff's counsel will face review by the Bar Association." He paused, then looked directly at Cassandra. "And as for you, Miss Vane, consider this ruling not as punishment, but as correction. The truth you tried to bury has a way of resurfacing. Her lips parted, but no words came. Her mother looked ready to faint. Her father's fists clenched so tight his knuckles turned white. I felt Owen's hand grasp mine under the table. He didn't speak either. His eyes said everything: relief, disbelief, gratitude all at once. The judge turned to the bailiff. Court is adjourned. The gavel fell, one last time. People stood. Reporters rushed toward the doors. Cassandra sat still, a statue of her own undoing. As I stood to leave, I caught Judge Farrow's gaze one last time. He gave a small nod, not of triumph, but of recognition. A silent acknowledgement between two people who had once shared broken marbles and promises of courage. I turned to Owen and whispered, "It's over, son. You can breathe again." He exhaled a long, shaking breath, tears glistening as he looked toward the bench, where justice had finally remembered his name. Was that justice, or revenge wrapped in a judge's robe? Tell me what you think below. News travels fast in small towns, especially when wealth loses to truth. By morning, every diner, beauty salon, and courthouse hallway buzzed with the same story. Cassandra Vane, daughter of prestige, had been caught lying under oath. The family that once ruled local gatherings with smug smiles now faced whispers and side glances. The Vanez's law firm quietly suspended their partnerships. Business associates backed away. Invitations stopped coming. Cassandra's father, Harold Vane, tried to suppress the story, but it spread faster than money could bury it. Reporters uncovered questionable tax dealings and aggressive land acquisitions that had once been praised as smart business. Now, they looked like greed in daylight. Cassandra's mother stopped appearing in public altogether. The woman who once judged every neighbor now hid behind drawn curtains. And Cassandra? She walked through town one afternoon to collect her belongings from the bank's safety box. Cameras followed. People didn't shout or mock, they just stared. Silence can be louder than humiliation. As she passed, one woman whispered, "That's her, the one who tried to destroy her husband." Cassandra kept her chin high, but her pace quickened. No amount of designer clothing could cover the truth that clung to her. The courtroom had taken her lies apart piece by piece, but the world finished the job. For every false word she'd spoken, a door quietly closed behind her. Owen returned to his classroom 2 weeks later. The same halls that once echoed with rumors now greeted him with nods of respect. Students who had once looked uncertain now raised their hands a little faster. He didn't brag or explain. He didn't need to. His calm presence was its own declaration that truth, when patient, always outlasts deceit. One afternoon, as he gathered books after class, a student approached shyly. "Mr. Peterson," she said, "my mom told me what happened. She said you never fought back in anger. That's strong." He smiled gently. "Sometimes the best fight is silence, until the right voice speaks for you." That night, he stopped by my house. We sat on the porch as twilight settled over Willow Creek. "Mom," he said quietly, "I don't know what you said to that judge, but thank you." I smiled. "You don't need to know. Just live a life that proves the truth was worth defending." He nodded, eyes soft with gratitude. For the first time in months, his laughter returned, a sound I hadn't realized I'd missed so much. The world had tried to strip him of his dignity, and yet, here he was stronger for surviving it. Sometimes justice doesn't roar. Sometimes it whispers through the steady heartbeat of someone who refuses to break. A week after the verdict, a sealed letter arrived at my door. No return address, just my name, written in careful script. Inside was a single sentence. "Thank you for reminding me who I was." And beneath it, one small object, the faded blue marble. I held it in my hand for a long time, the same way I had decades earlier when a frightened boy clutched it and promised he'd make something of himself. Tears came, quiet and unforced. It wasn't sadness, it was recognition. The past had completed its circle. That evening, I placed the marble on the windowsill beside my husband's photograph. Outside, the cicadas hummed, and the streetlights blinked to life one by one. For the first time in a long time, peace didn't feel like surrender. It felt like balance restored. Justice, it turned out, had a long memory. And sometimes, when the world least expects it, kindness comes back wearing a robe. If you believe karma never forgets, subscribe before the next twist. When the house finally fell silent that night, I sat alone at the kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea, the kind my husband used to make before bed. The trial, the noise, the anger, it had all settled into quiet. The marble rested beside my cup, faintly glowing under the yellow lamp. I turned it over in my hand and thought about how far life had carried me. We live long enough, and we learn that pain doesn't vanish, it transforms. It becomes wisdom. It becomes patience. Sometimes it even becomes justice. Owen had gone home hours earlier. I knew he'd sleep for the first time in months. That was victory enough for me. As for Cassandra and her family, life would teach them the same lessons they'd ignored for years. I didn't need to wish them harm. Truth already had a way of finding its balance. I looked out the window, saw the moonlight spread across the yard, and felt something I hadn't in years: peace. Not because everything was perfect, but because everything was finally honest. When you reach my age, you stop wishing for revenge and start praying for clarity. And that night, I had both. If you've been listening this far, let me tell you something. Never underestimate a mother's love. It doesn't fade with age or distance, it sharpens, it waits, it watches, and when the time comes, it moves quietly but decisively. I didn't fight with anger. I fought with memory. I fought with the truth I carried long before my son was born. That's what real loyalty looks like. It doesn't need to shout to be powerful. I've seen people destroy themselves trying to get even. But vengeance without purpose only breeds more pain, the kind that keeps you up at night and steals your peace of mind. What I wanted wasn't destruction, it was correction. I wanted the world to remember that honesty still matters, that good people still deserve to stand tall. My son didn't win because I interfered. He won because he lived with integrity when no one was watching. I just reminded someone with power, what that kind of strength looks like. If you take anything from my story, let it be this. Truth may bend, but it never breaks. It waits for the right moment to stand again, and when it does, no lie can outlast it. Sometimes I wonder what that little boy, Hobo Harry, would think if he could see how far we both came. Maybe he'd smile, knowing that one act of kindness can echo through an entire lifetime. And maybe that's what real revenge looks like, not fire and fury, but dignity restored. Because revenge isn't always about destruction. Sometimes it's about restoration of dignity, of faith, of what's right. I may be an old woman now, but I still believe goodness wins eventually. It just takes patience, and a heart that refuses to forget what's worth protecting. So, if you've ever loved someone enough to fight for them, even when the world told you to stay silent, then you understand me. You understand why I walked into that courtroom, why the judge froze when he saw me, and why I never looked away. That's not just justice, that's legacy. If you'd stand up for your family the same way, hit that subscribe button. Only subscribers get the stories that prove good still wins. Don't miss the next one.